touch each other, please. They go right down deep, and they have collided. So both the BWT cars collide.
So it's an inside squabble between the two Williams. Look to me like Rosberg tapped the back of Webber. That is absolutely the last thing any Formula One team wants to see.
That's a Lacey and Heidfeld. I don't know what's happened, but it's the big poor Alain Prost, as if he hadn't got enough pressure on him.
We've lost a wheel. It's a racing engineering car that's ripped his left wheel off. Furious at his teammate. That will be a very fun team briefing.
Hello everyone and welcome to Teammate Collision, the official podcast of gprejects.com. From lovely and sunny Schleswig-Holstein, it's your host Lennart, and I'm joined as usual by my very good friend Jeremy. How are you?
Good afternoon, Lennart. I'm doing fine. It is equally sunny, a little bit windy here in Helsinki. I have cycled about 2 hours in the last 2 days, so I am sweating like nothing else. It is a fantastic summer holiday. I hope everyone's having a good summer. This is going to be a, shall I say, bit more relaxed podcast. We just jumped on with the big news in Formula One, which has happened about 1 hour ago.
Indeed. AlphaTauri has decided to release their current driver, Nick De Vries, and loan none other than the one, the only Daniel Ricciardo from Red Bull to take his place.
Yeah, our 2022 Reject of the Year is making a, I would say, it's difficult to say surprise comeback when it's the AlphaTauri Red Bull Helmut Marko machine, because on one hand they continue to surprise you, but on the other hand it's so predictable because they're the only team on the grid who would do this kind of thing.
There's a certain poetry to it, as you said. Only one who would do it, but then again, if we are living in an era where it's really surprising, or not really surprising, as you said, they aren't surprising, but unorthodox driver choices are becoming more and more of a rarity, so I am not complaining.
Yeah, it will be very strange. So for context, like anyone who's not watching Formula One right now but still listens to us, basically Nick De Vries has been driving for 10 races plus the one race he did for Williams last year at Monza where he got that great 9th place. He's been not great, to say the least. He's underperformed and now he's been sacked as of about an hour ago. And it's, as Lennart says, it's interesting because we live in a world now where contracts are far more let's say secure than they used to be in the old days, but that also goes with the ever increasing regularity of Formula One, down to how everything is run and how everything is being, I mean, we've talked in the past about everything being franchised, and the drivers are part of that as well, the brand of each driver. So for drivers such as Nick De Vries to get canned not even into the halfway point of the season, because we still got one more round to go before our summer break hits. But in general, it's such a rarity these days, as Lennart says, that someone like Nick De Vries gets canned before he has a full season, for example, to prove himself. But I don't know. Do you think it's the right move? Do you think it's worth bringing Ricciardo back?
Well, honestly, I don't think so, unless they're following some bigger picture, like putting the pressure on Sergio Perez to up his game. The thing with Ricciardo is, yeah, he was a very great driver when he had his, well, I don't want to say 15 minutes of fame because that would be too harsh, but you get the point. When he was at the top of his game, let's call it that way, that is better. There he was a pretty good driver, but in the last years, before he was let go by McLaren, he just dropped off significantly, and I don't think there's really much point unless Red Bull are really not sure whether Yuki Tsunoda is that guy or whether he's not that guy, because for some reason they don't think the comparison to Gasly was any useful, or for that matter the comparison to De Vries. So I don't see much point in it, but perhaps they are of the opinion that it wouldn't make much sense to bring in a young one now, a rookie, because that would be the only other logical, for lack of a better term, option. So yeah, it's a complex one.
I'm a bit confused by it happening. But my theory about it is that Helmut Marko has publicly stated that AlphaTauri will not be called as such next year. And there's rumors that the team may be sold. There's rumors that it may go under some kind of different purpose as compared to how it is now. And it may be that, I mean, Red Bull usually rush these decisions. They usually make jarring short-term decisions for long-term gain, such as Verstappen's hiring in the first place. But it also goes for firing. And I just wonder, in the general sense, it's possible that they're trying to get Ricciardo in Perez's place if Perez maybe he's fallen out with the team because he's had a bad couple of races as well. Maybe things are just kind of falling apart internally with Sergio. But it may be that Red Bull are trying to react quickly to a system of driver management which they don't run anymore. So if for example, AlphaTauri is being sold off to someone else and Red Bull don't have control of it, they need to organize their junior team very quickly. Because if we're in a situation where Perez is out the door at the end of the year, this is a hypothetical, I don't have any evidence for this, but let's say Perez is out at the end of the year, they will want, De Vries is not going to be the one replacing him. So they'll need either Tsunoda or someone who can beat Tsunoda. And the only person that they have in their driver pool who is potentially doing that is Max Verstappen's former teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, whom they bought after McLaren. He and McLaren agreed to part ways after his disastrous year last year. That's my theory. I don't have any evidence for it, but I think it is somewhat typical of their short-term movements, making big sweeping changes to their driver lineup. How well he will do is another question, because we said that 2022 was Ricciardo's unexpected last chance saloon, but now it's his driving at AlphaTauri. If he can beat Tsunoda convincingly, then we'll know that he's still got it. If he doesn't, then
It's over.
Yeah, it's then Ricciardo really has to realize publicly and privately, okay, F1 it's not going to happen. He has to move on somewhere else. But so for that aspect, it will be very interesting to see where it goes. It's a bit boring to see someone who's so established come back. He's already done 500 races, so we know Ricciardo. He's a big media personality and he has a brand behind him. But at least for the perspective of him and Tsunoda fighting for their careers, it will be interesting.
Yes, I fully agree. It's a very interesting move by the Red Bull driver program, which obviously, as we have said, is always been known for making some unexpected choices to the point that they become expected. But of course, one struggles to argue with the results because Red Bull have produced more than one driver capable of winning championships. And with that, we go to the first question of our Q&A session, which this more casual, more relaxed podcast will be. Because De Vries sort of had the temerity to interrupt our original plans for this podcast.
Damn him. Yeah.
That's why he got sacked, actually.
I mean, all this originally stems from a conversation which Lennart and I had about Kamui Kobayashi, I think, off mic, and it got us thinking that we should ask the Discord group, what the GP Rejects Discord group, that is, just questions for us. If they have anything that they want to know our opinions about, what we think about, if we can add any insight or analysis. That would be questionable, but we can at least chat about it and see if there's anything we can potentially provide. So we threw out a bunch of questions, and we got quite a number of responses from a certain couple of users who we'll give shout-outs to at the end. But the first one was, as you mentioned, was somewhat connected to Nick De Vries.
Yes, and the first question is, which championship-capable driver was most deserving of a championship-capable drive, but didn't get one?
Yeah, sorry, we're leading back to Ricciardo, of course, because Ricciardo walked into Red Bull and pretty much comfortably beat Sebastian Vettel in the first year that Red Bull's downturn happened. So they had their period in the doldrums from, well, basically during Mercedes' period of domination, coincided with Red Bull fighting for third or second in the championship, which was most of the time when Ricciardo was driving for them.
Incidentally, that's a very fascinating definition of downturn we have.
Yeah, true. I mean, we're so
But
we're so used these days in Formula One to the same three teams, Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes, winning everything or finishing in the top three for the last 14 or 15 consecutive seasons, that you get used to it for a while, after a while at least. But my point I guess I was meaning by that is when Red Bull didn't have a championship capable F1 car was the same time that Ricciardo was leading the team. So I would say he was definitely deserving of a championship capable car, which he never got. When he was, especially 2014 and 2016, he was basically the best of the rest in terms of the driver quality that we were talking about outside of those two Mercedes drivers, Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton. Things fell apart from him in 2018 when he and Verstappen, it was very clear that Marco and the management were doing to him what they did to Webber, whereby the team was basically being organized and set up around Verstappen because he was the one who they had put all their effort and resources into, and he was the one who was the youngest and had the most potential. And Ricciardo didn't want to be a number 2 driver, he wanted to be a number 1 driver. So whether you respect him for that or not, he left Red Bull after 2018 and his career. He did okay at Renault, scored a couple of good podiums, but when the new rules came in 2022, it fell apart. That's a very long set of context, but the main point is that when he was driving for the top team, it was only the second or third best team on the grid, which in Mercedes domination days was quite far behind. So I don't think anyone could have actually won the championship outside of Mercedes during those years, which is a shame because I think Ricciardo at his best was probably the best of the rest drivers.
yes, sometimes that is something that is not so much with Ricciardo, but with rejects in general, something we also note on our side, that especially nowadays, often the difference between a reject and a non-reject is merely a window of opportunity being open or closed at the right or wrong time. So yeah, Ricciardo got a bit unlucky that his ascension came a bit too quickly, but that's how it is, and that's how the Red Bull program can sometimes be, because, and that is a perfect link to one of my answers, because one candidate for a championship capable driver that didn't even get so much as a race winner was in fact Ricciardo's teammate from 2013, Jean-Eric Verne.
Yeah, Verne is an interesting case. Same idea. The point I was going to make, which applies to Verne as well, is that we were just talking about how contracts are pretty much set in stone these days, and it's very hard to have any kind of organic switching of drivers or lineups, and that makes it even more solidified at the top especially when you have 2 or 3 very young drivers like Leclerc, Russell, Sainz, and Max Verstappen, obviously, who are very entrenched in their top teams. It makes it even harder for those, whether they're rejects striving for that 4th place, or whether they're drivers who don't visit our website and are looking to get points, wins, podiums, or whatever, championships one day. I would say it's much harder nowadays for that to happen, and you get more examples of drivers who are outside of that possibility, not through, I guess, more through the sterility and sort of orderliness of modern F1. But to get back onto what we were saying, Jean-Eric Verne, why him in particular? What did he do before and after F1, or even during F1, which would qualify him as being in this list?
Well, for one, if we are going to count Ricciardo as a championship-capable driver, which I also do, we have to remember that Verne was more or less on level with him, and what got Ricciardo the edge back when it was time to replace Mark Webber, it's that he had he had a tendency to provide more quote-unquote flashy results, which some might argue is actually against the principle of a championship-winning driver, because especially nowadays when Formula One calendars are longer and longer than ever, it's more and more important to actually be good week in, week out. And one thing that would showcase Vern's ability to do that is his multiple world championships in Formula E, a series which one might argue is actively opposed to the concept of consistency. so including titles that were won long before the final race of the season. So clearly that against a strong driver field, it must be also noted. So yeah, I think with these performances and the fact that he was on par with Ricciardo, I think it's safe to say that someone like Jean Verne, if he had gotten to the Red Bull at the right time, would have probably been just as much a candidate of winning championships as Ricciardo would have been. And well, I won't say he's on the level of a Max Verstappen, but then again, neither was Ricciardo. So
yeah, it brings up a very interesting, that really does open a whole can of worms, because like I agree with you that Verne was basically on par with Ricciardo, and in fact when Ricciardo was at Toro Rosso, I didn't think very highly of him. He would get an occasionally flashy performance. I think I even mentioned this in our 2012 season review, that like he got a couple of very good qualifying performances, especially I think at Bahrain and at Abu Dhabi. But in terms of his actual consistency and his actual overall performance, I would say Verne was a lot more mature. But as you say, team bosses usually go for the 1 in a million excellent run, rather than the it's like the whole Napoleon wanting the generals who are lucky rather than the generals who are smart, because luck usually how should I say, comes to itself as more than just itself. But I agree. I think Verne is very good, and his achievements outside of Formula One really prove it. Probably more so than many other drivers. Another example I would give, which is actually one of my another Red Bull driver, is Sebastian Buemi, who I think really didn't get any kind of machinery which would have been capable of showing off his actual performance, which I would say he has shown in just about most any other discipline he's ever been in. I don't know how much do you rate Buemi, who is also a Formula E champion, a 2-time Formula E champion, if you listen to me, that is.
Yeah, he's also a very good driver. I would put him below Verne, but honestly, that is as much a praise of Verne as it is quote-unquote criticism of Buemi. So, I mean, the fact that he more or less came in and took Bourdais behind the barn, so to speak, in 2009 is a strong achievement. I don't know about you, but I rate Bourdais even as a Formula One driver, but Buemi had the complete edge on him, especially in qualifying. So yeah, he was a pretty good driver who, let's just say, if Verne was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or Ricciardo was in the wrong place at the wrong time, then Buemi was doubly in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, he was at Toro Rosso during at least 3 years actually, when Vettel and Webber were the established duo. I mean, had Webber gone to Ferrari, as some of the contract rumors were saying, and maybe he would have had a chance. I would say he easily would have had the chance of him and Alguersuari. But then again, Red Bull.
Yeah, they do the unexpected.
Who's to say they wouldn't have just hired Alguersuari anyway, because he was young. He's younger, and he's a full 6 months younger, so therefore he has more potential and more pizzazz about him. Buemi was consistent and he was good, and he's proven that by winning like however many Le Mans, however many World Endurance Championships, however many Formula E titles. Like, I think it's
a winner.
It's also a testament, I would say, to Buemi that he was also on the list of people being hired back when they took Brendan Hartley back. This is the Red Bull team running out of options and hiring Brendan Hartley in 2018 as well. Buemi was on the short list, very high up on the short list of drivers who were potentially making a very long gap comeback to Formula One. And part of me really wishes that had happened, because I would have loved to have seen a second wave of Sebastian Buemi success. Although maybe it would have been as dull and forgettable, so to speak, as his results would look if you only looked at his results in Formula One. But I think very highly of him. I would say he was easily a solid driver material, and he deserved far more than a couple of years in the back of the grid Toro Rosso, which is what he got.
Yeah, and on the topic of deserving more than back of the grid drives, we're going to go with something that is both controversial yet completely obvious, and I am going to say the one, the only Pascal Wehrlein as one of the drivers who had the potential but didn't get his shot. Now, obviously, I'm going to predict the usual doubts about, oh no, Wehrlein wasn't a championship capable driver. But
you're slashing out against ghosts here. I haven't said a word.
Not you, but I know our listeners. No, but his results in 2016 speak for themselves. He did manage to score points on more or less merit in the manner in its last year of existence. The last driver to score points for one of the 2010 teams, and that alone is pretty much a very good sign. His body of work before Formula One speaks for itself. The youngest DTM champion of all time, back when the DTM title meant something. And then his year with Sauber was also mostly speaking for itself. Yeah, beating Ericsson by 11-7 in races and 11-6 in qualifying. Wait, that was actually the other way around, was it not? Yes, the other way around. 11-7 in qualifying, and Ericsson lost 6-11 in races where both finished, with obviously Ericsson then going on to be an Indianapolis 500 winner, possibly even two-time Indianapolis 500 winner, if not for a questionable red flag.
Which you can read about in Lennart's latest gravel trap. Well, his second most recent gravel trap. But yes, Pascal Wehrlein did pretty well. I would say he at least was... Well, I would say his achievements kind of speak for themselves in terms of before and after F1 and during. The only thing I've heard, which I think I may have even brought up before, was his reputation of being, quote, difficult to work with, unquote, which is sometimes the... how should I say? It's the umbrella term for someone who has personality difference with the people he works with, or with the work ethic in general.
And given us the Mercedes drive in 2017 that got free when Nico Rosberg retired, and the driver who was hired to fill that role, it was very obvious that Mercedes were mostly looking for someone who wouldn't cause quite the discord that Hamilton had with Rosberg. So yes, a driver with, for lack of a better word, personality issues, whichever, a driver that was hard to work with, however exactly that would look like, was probably not in their plans at the time, but logic would have said that he, as the main and most successful product of the Mercedes driver program, unless you want to count Esteban Ocon, which in 2016 you couldn't have, and with that in mind, he was obviously not given the opportunity I felt he should have had, and the quote-unquote logic of a junior program would say he should have had. But
like,
yeah.
Also, one thing about all these drivers we've mentioned so far, except for Ricciardo, is that Buemi, Verne, and Wehrlein were all very young as well. Like we also live in an era whereby these drivers who probably mature, like if you asked me personally, like what I think, most drivers I would say peak in their late 20s, early 30s. I would say if I think of most of the best seasons of very good drivers of the last 20 years or so are usually when they're in their early 30s. I would say Schumacher's best years in the early years of in these championship years at Ferrari, Fernando Alonso's time at Ferrari as well, where both of those drivers' best years. I would say even Jenson Button, for example, really matured and did well when he was in his first couple of years at McLaren. And we're living in an era now whereby you have to kind of prove yourself by the time you're 20 or 21, whereas people like Jean Alesi were being claimed as like, oh, the very young French Sicilian who's only 25, who's joining Formula One now.
Yeah.
I do feel pity for those people, especially like the Jan Magnussens of the world, whose personalities don't match when they're so young and they're dumb enough that they make these stupid mistakes that they don't listen. They just shout and they say the wrong thing or they do the wrong thing, and it goes against them for the entire rest of their life, or at least if they want to get to the top echelon of Formula One, but there just are so few second chances.
Yeah, fully agreed. I mean, let's be honest, I can only speak for myself, but if I look back at 20-year-old Lennart, he was the very opposite of mature. Some would say I'm still not mature, but hey, that's neither here nor there. And yeah, when you look at that type of personality, that type of developing young person, you obviously are going to be left with some issues that just don't really work for a championship winning organization, to get back to the original question, which is why I've always jokingly said if I were at the Formula One team boss, I would never hire a rookie under 27, but which is obviously a hyperbolic, but it just shows that chances at the top level are rare, and if you haven't matured enough for whatever reason there might be, it's just a very rough business nowadays.
Yeah, I suppose it always has been, but today it's rough in a far more polished way. That doesn't make any sense when I say it out loud, but you know what I mean. It's like it's because it's far more ordered. There's far fewer opportunities to get into the sport, and when you do, you're much younger, so you have basically a huge amount of pressure in a very short time, as Nick de Vries is testament to.
Well, since you mentioned it's nowadays a very different form of a rough business, but always has been, then let's find out where the business has been at its smoothest, or where the rough edges were the most charming, because the next question we were sent in is, when do each of you believe Formula One peaked?
I hate this question because it's Formula One peaked the first season that I started watching. Is usually
classic, absolute classic.
That's usually the answer. It peaked in terms of what? Peaked in terms of money, I would say probably last year or 2021. But peaked in terms of enjoyment for the races, like, gosh, like it depends on what you want out of F1. Depends on how it peaked. If you're asking this question just in terms of my opinion, based entirely on my own arbitrary principles of what I expect F1 to be, gosh, something like early mid-90s, I guess, even late 90s. I would say most of the 1990s had a generally decent rule set. They had interesting rule changes. They had, the grid wasn't maybe the highest quality of all time, as many people will probably be thinking when they hear this. But I would say in terms of the racing, in terms of the ability to get in, the ability for people to show themselves, and the good races themselves, I would say early, mid, late 90s.
Yeah, but the points you made were very interesting about the nature of what the term peaked implies. Obviously, it has the certain connotation that obviously everything after the peak is downwards, and while everyone who has ever climbed one of the 8,000ers will tell you that the descent is just as important as the peak, we are all really here for the summit. And that is why I fully agree with the principle that the question is a very difficult one to answer. I personally am going to do the thing you more or less sarcastically did by saying the first season I started watching is the best one. In a variation, it's the first season I restarted watching. As those who will remember my introduction from the very first episode will remember, I quit Formula One in the Schumacher domination because I was a salty child who couldn't handle a driver that he didn't like winning.
Don't worry, I'm an adult who can't stand watching drivers. I don't like winning, so.
Anyway, the thing is, I returned in 2007, and to me, the 2007-2008 period is indeed the closest to how I would like Formula One to be. See, I am very much on the principle of Formula One as a peak of engineering, philosophy, concept, whatever. There are many people who are not a fan of how the cars from that era looked. And in a way, I don't blame them. All the additional winglets, all the obscene aero devices they had, in particular the 2008 Honda with its wings on the monocoque, where...
You mean the most beautiful F1 car ever made?
Yes, except most people would see that statement as sarcastic.
Isn't that sad? The 2008 Honda is a beautiful car, especially with the extra stuff on it. It's a fantastic. It looks like a spaceship. I love it. It's exactly it's exactly the idea of F1 as the future. And I do agree that like 2007, 2008, the way the cars looked is very good. A lot of good races in those era as well. Like if you had that era with grooved tires, it would basically be up there with the old time eras.
Yeah, and that is why I feel it's one of the most visually appealing eras. It also is a very competitive era all in all, while individual races weren't the down to the last lap type of events usually. It was always pretty certain that you could, heading into a weekend, not quite tell who would be on top. Like you would know, obviously, especially in 2007, the race would be won by either McLaren or Ferrari. But you didn't know which McLaren, you didn't know which Ferrari. And of course 2008, with its million race winners, is that taken to a whole nother level, because even outside of the winners, you had a very competitive, very tight midfield. Like the only thing you really knew heading into a weekend before you saw the free practice and everything, was that the two Force Indias would be at the back of the grid, and ahead of the two Super Aguri's for the first 5 races. So that is one thing, another aspect from that era that is very appealing, and nowadays in Formula One is regrettably very much missing, the competitiveness of it all. Obviously helped by a lot of manufacturers pumping in a lot of money into the sport.
Yeah, it's something I've said, which I think is a big problem of what happened after the mid 2000s when the cost cutting happened, was the lack of variation. They cut away a lot of the natural variation which had built up over those years in terms of different engines. There was a time in the early 2010s where we had about 3 or 4 engine like suppliers for something like 11 or 12 teams, which is like, if you think back to the 90s when basically every team had their own developer, their own suppliers, or their own manufacturers in some way. We had different types of tires. We had different. There were fewer of the enforced gimmick rules to say that you have to do this during a race, or you have to have this limitation during a weekend. On one side for cost cutting, on one side for spicing up the show to make sure stuff actually happens. Because and it's one reason why I wouldn't. My first season was 2010 in terms of my first full watching, although I do remember watching races with my dad all the way back to the early 2000s as well. He would tell you that F1 died when Jim Clark died, but that's another story. I would say that the 2010s suffer from, although the racing was often quite good, I would say it came at an artificial cost, and I would say that if you want to know where F1 peaked, I wouldn't say it peaked in an era whereby the show was put as the only reason, the only thing to push forward. Mm-hmm. I think there has to be some kind of product and some substance underneath it, and I think that's one reason why 2000s and the 90s work so well is because they were pushing boundaries and they were trying to get, whether it was the fastest cars or whether it was whether it was the technology on those cars being used to develop roadworthy things, whatever it might have been. I don't know where I was rambling with that, but in general, I agree that that kind of era before the cost-cutting procedures was a peak era. It was also the peak spending era, I'll say that.
Yeah. Especially so nowadays with the budget cap era we are living in, there would be a lot more opportunities to liberate the ideas of Formula One. After all, if you remember in the original plan by Max Mosley to have the budget cap, it was very much explicitly meant to pair with a liberalization of the rules in many aspects. As I said in the 2009 review, I recall there even being discussions about in four-wheel drive Formula One cars. Again, I don't know whether that would have done actually anything good, but it would have been certainly a lot more interesting than the comparatively similar cars we have today with the comparatively similar, well, okay, I was going to go with strategies, but that actually makes no sense because the four-wheel drive doesn't have anything to do with pit stops, I think. So that was kind of nowhere. But yeah, as you said, a lot more innovation back in the days. Of course, some would argue that because in so many ways aerodynamics have advanced so much nowadays that there simply isn't that much more room for creativity, but that's something aerodynamicists will correct us on. If you want to, feel free to comment. And yeah, one more thing I think is noteworthy from that entire period from the late 2000s is that Formula One started expanding into newer markets like Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, China, but they didn't have this current situation where they just basically take every comer who pays enough. Hello, Saudi Arabia. So it was still
as
that
quickly as possible as well. Like, it's very very short-term vision these days, where it's like here's some money being offered to us, let's say yes immediately, kind of thing.
Indeed.
It was something that Mohammed Ben Sulayem actually pointed out when he was talking about the potential 200 million. Was it 200 million? How much was it? It was.
I think it was 200 million.
Being offered to basically buy Formula One, and it was just like, were we actually considering this? Was this going to be something whereby it's like, oh look, here's a bunch of money, we're just going to say yes to it? Like, it's very nowadays. It's very short-term focused in terms of purchasing, in terms of, as you say, innovating into new markets, and yeah, if I had a philosophical answer to give to this question, it would be that something definitely peaks after a certain amount of time, which it can never peak again. And I think the reason is because modern F1 has the problem of 74 seasons of history. And when you have history, you follow rules or ideas on the basis of this is how things have been done in the past, rather than this is a sensible idea or this is a relevant idea. That goes for the fans as well as the actual organizers themselves. People want a product which they're used to. This goes for all media and movies and stuff. And by having history, it can work against new ideas and new concepts of what Formula One should be. Which is why, to any person who's listening to us who only watches Formula One, please watch other series as well, because you'll see all sorts of other interesting ideas, some better, some worse, and it will really open your horizons as to what kind of series F1 could be.
I fully support this method, as evidenced by the fact that I have, among other things, done a gravel trap on why you should watch Brazilian stock car racing.
Why should people watch Brazilian stock cars, Nerd?
Because, among other reasons, I don't want to spend the entire time reading the gravel trap. It has basically taken many of the ideas of other series and just said, what if we do this, but we do it intelligently? Like the infamous segmented races from NASCAR. They just instead have 2 races, which count as full championship races each. They run them back to back, revert the top 10 for a bit little to spice it up a little, and reduce the points of the second race a bit to account for that quote-unquote unfairness. And then they just have the second race and the second stage, so to speak, immediately thereafter, which is often very fun. And, of course, another thing is that they have all the Brazilian big names you can ever want. If you ever wondered, what is a former Brazilian Formula 1 driver doing now? The answer is most likely he's doing Brazilian stock car.
Is Ricardo Rosset there?
Not anymore, unfortunately.
Damn.
But he used to compete in the series as well. So again, either they have been in stock car or they are in stock car.
What about Tarso Marquez? He's Brazilian, right?
Yes, he's Brazilian. He also used to compete in the series. I don't think he does anymore, but he afterwards went on to design a very interesting LMP style car to use in another Brazilian series. So he's doing well for himself.
What about the late, great Enrico Bernoldi?
I think he also did, but that was a very short time.
I've got it here, yeah. He had 2 podiums in Brazilian stock cars in 2007.
That is one more podium than Felipe Massa has, who only on Sunday scored his first second place finish in the series. So
I don't want to hear any slander against Felipe Massa, so we shall move on.
Yes, indeed. Moving on is a good choice because, as you mentioned, Formula 1 has a lot of history, and during that history, the length of a season has varied a lot from the current 24 races if Liberty Media had their way to the, was it 7 races of the first season or was it 6?
Yeah, in the early days it was about somewhere between 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10.
Yes, and now one of the questions sent in was, what is the perfect length for a Formula 1 calendar?
Again, if I said 16, then anyone listening to this could go, aha, Jeremy, but you just said 3 minutes ago that people watching and people organizing things only do so because that's the way things are done, not because it's a great idea. 16 is probably the most commonly used number. For a long time it was around 15 to 17 from when it was, the mid-70s to the late 2000s. So judging by averages, you could say 16. I certainly wouldn't say more than 18. 18 is already pretty much burnout level for me. I personally like the idea of the Grand Prix. The idea of the value of a Grand Prix. That there are very few events, I think it's only New Zealand and Macau outside of Formula 1 who have the phrase Grand Prix as their official race. And I like the idea of the Grand Prix meaning something. So I'm generally against long calendars, not just for fatigue, but also for the idea that this is a real event, not just some corporate idea where celebrities come and spend money and people get charged 400 euros for a ticket. But like, this is actually a big sporting event, the way that the Monaco is, the way that the 24 Hours of Le Mans is, the way that the Indy 500 is. So I would say less. Fewer is better in general. In the modern age, it's tough. It's tough to say. Like, would 12 be too few in the modern age? In this age of oversaturation and more and more and more for everything, but something like, I would say even 10 or 12 races would be fine for a Formula 1 season.
No, I actually don't think that would be too little. Of course, fans would complain that it is too little, but fans complain about everything.
Us included.
No, that's seriously, I think it would be too little from the commercial standpoint, but since I wrote a gravel trap on this, obviously, so don't expect me to answer this in long form, because I already did in a way. You have to think, or you have to imagine that there's the commercial thought in the back of our heads. But even then, I feel I can agree with you, because on the account of less is more, because in the end, while more races makes them more money immediately, if you have fewer races, then you could make those races a lot more valuable in themselves, not just from the sporting points, but also from the commercial point, because then you can do long build-ups, you can get the media really going, like, is this going to be the week where Max Verstappen falls? It probably won't be, but if you give that
no is the answer.
If you give that like 3 or 4 weeks to cook, then you can really boil it down, especially now, for example, after this weekend, after the British Grand Prix, I don't know when the Hungarian Grand Prix is. I think it was the week after we're recording this, but I don't know it for sure. But if you had like 3 weeks where you could boil down, where you could run marketing, like Lando Norris is back in the game and Lewis Hamilton is looking to attack Max Verstappen, that is hype. And hype sells tickets, hype sells TV sets to watch Sky with, I guess. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And the thing is, and of course, you can also, as much as some people would consider that a bad thing, really squeeze all the tracks to give you the maximum amount of money, because if you can't squeeze out teams because to raise the value of the teams that already exist, then you can do the same with tracks. Then you can simply say, okay, we have, like, I don't know, Monaco, the British Grand Prix, whatever you want, as the quote-unquote divine, untouchable masterpiece, but everyone else, you could say, whoever gets the most money gets the prestige, and so I feel you could easily make the same amount of money or even more if you condense everything. But outside of that, I also just generally agree with your point of view that a Grand Prix should be something special, that we should be not in a situation where we think, oh dear, it's F1 again, but oh yeah, F1 again, finally. It's been so long and we're so hyped and everything is
the calendar.
going on.
The next race shouldn't be a threat. It should be something to look forward to.
Yeah, and again, everything else has been said in the gravel trap. We will try to put that one in the comment as well, but obviously the description is going to be long at this point.
I'll just link the gravel trap. It's fine.
All right.
I would say that, like, my ideal F1 calendar. Again, I'm gonna make like an evasive answer here, but my ideal F1 would be something like tennis, whereby you would have 10 or 12 Grand Prix, and they would be part of the World Championship. And then there would be other Grand Prix which would be part of other, maybe European championships, Asian championships, or just Grand Prix which give money to the teams, sort of thing. Like they're the grand prize of the team wins this much money and they can use it, whatever. Like encouraging private teams to enter as long as they go with the rules, this kind of thing. This is a very old-fashioned way of looking at it, but my ideal F1, even in 2023, would be something like that. But
that is a very interesting Formula One. I certainly would want to watch that. Anyway, since we talked about the gravel trap, let's use that as a very vague segue to the next more or less set of questions. Because who ends up in the gravel trap? Drivers who take a lot of risk. Who, or better said, which nation is known for producing Formula One drivers that take a lot of risks?
Japan?
Exactly. And
wow. It's
again,
almost like I didn't know the question beforehand.
It's obviously... yeah, it's a very good guess. Jeremy being genius as usual. Anyway. As I said, it's more or less a complex of questions, because we got multiple questions on Japanese drivers, almost like our community likes them. Who could have guessed? Anyway, let's begin with the direct one. The best and worst Japanese Formula One drivers. We were given a limit of at least 3 races they entered, but yeah.
Yeah, that's I can tell you the best ones more easily than the worst ones. And then are we asking, are these the best drivers in Formula One or the best drivers overall? Because something like Toru Takagi, perhaps Kamui Kobayashi, Takuma Sato, of course, would be that they've been far more successful. Even Nakajima Jr. would be, I would say, far more successful internationally than their parents' generation ever were. So I feel like it's natural to say that those drivers from the late 90s to the present day would be in those best ones.
Yeah, I think
please.
I think the question probably intends to look at their Formula One performance alone. So, but that's just a guess.
Do I have to answer this question?
You can obviously pass if you don't feel like going out there, especially since, again, it's more or less a complex of questions. So we'll.
I'm going to answer the F1 driver who was driving in the first season that I watched, therefore is the best one. Kamui Kobayashi is... I found his driving spectacular in an era, especially in 2010, when there were very few overtakes, very little in the way of exciting maneuvers. He seemed to be driving on a different wavelength. He drove in the way that Max Verstappen drove, to maybe less of an extreme the way that Verstappen drove, but people talked about the Verstappen way when he came into Formula One, about how he was far more aggressive in the overtaking. He was crazy in how he would set up his overtakes, and I feel like Kobayashi had that same kind of vibe where it felt like he was a completely different kind of driver to most of the people around him, and for that reason I really, really enjoyed watching him drive. And I feel like had he had more money was one thing he lacked, especially in an era of the early mid-2010s when most of the teams were bankrupt. That had he had more money, I feel like he would have had probably the longest career of any Japanese driver. I reckon he could have had the career of Kevin Magnussen or Nico Hulkenberg or Sergio Perez, even if he'd had more money behind him. But he's my answer.
Well, I, for one, am going to do something similar and go back to the quote-unquote first season I watched, because my answer for the best would be Takuma Sato. The thing is, while I don't disagree with the perception of Kobayashi as the very aggressive driver, the one who actually made the daring overtakes and got them to work, which is something, let's be honest, a lot of Japanese drivers beforehand did kind of struggle with.
I have the image of Toru Takagi on Pedro de la Rosa at Suzuka in my mind now, of both of them in the air.
And in that case, one could make a very solid case that he is the best or the greatest or whatever. I personally just feel like Sato's whole package as a driver just was that little bit further ahead, that he had the pace, that especially in the late years, once he was at Super Aguri, he was a very reliable driver, someone who could be trusted to get what the car had and get the job done. While admittedly having early in his career more the tendency to do the overtakes that didn't work, later in his career he was very sensible about that. Of course, the infamous 2007 Canadian Grand Prix pass against
you can't mention Sato without mentioning the Canadian Grand Prix that year.
That is why I shouldn't say infamous, but actually famous.
Is that the best moment for a Japanese driver in Formula One? Are there more glorious moments than Sato's overtake on Alonso?
Well, it depends on how much you value home podiums, because that was the one thing that always evaded Sato, so that the podium in general did. And that is something Aguri Suzuki and Kamui Kobayashi managed to do, which is to get a podium at their home race, which obviously were glorious moments, especially Kobayashi, who apparently was cool enough on his drive to third that he managed to joke with his engineer that his car was dying, which is incidentally a very cruel joke.
Yeah, you're just asking for it. You're just asking to have a Nigel Mansell moment.
Yeah, but the thing is, obviously, I personally would pick Sato's overtake as the number one moment for a Japanese driver, simply because, well, in particular Kobayashi's podium has this air under it that, yeah, he did manage to get a podium at his home race, but and by that point Sergio Perez had 4 podiums, 5? So it was more what took you so long, mate? moment especially in hindsight. So I would personally put Sato at number 1, but I sure am not going to be offended by anyone saying either of the Japanese home podiums were better.
I was expecting a far more sarcastic answer from you. You didn't mention Takagi crashing out of his last race.
I mean, if we're talking about that, then obviously there's no real discussion, because the greatest moment in Japanese racing was where Murray Walker, the late great Murray Walker, called none other than Ukio Katayama the greatest driver Grand Prix racing had ever produced. So there wasn't really a debate now, is there?
I forgot about that line. Yeah, it never ceases to make me laugh. The best thing when people make mistakes like that is to imagine that they're not making a mistake, that they genuinely believe that. I like to think that Murray Walker genuinely believed that of all the drivers he supported, that Ukio Katayama was actually the best ever.
He let the mask slip.
Let the mask slip.
You can't officially say that because it would attract controversy, but sometimes you just crack and let out one that you really feel.
But there's other moments of Japanese greatness, like when Taki Inui got hit by a safety car, or when his car got crushed by a recovery vehicle in Monaco, or when Yuji Ide tried to kill Christian Albers at the San Marino. There's all sorts of wonderful positive moments. Not to mention the actually positive moment when that famous fastest lap got stolen. Was it Hoshino's fastest lap at Fuji? Never forget. It's the biggest crime against fastest laps since Nikita Mazepin's fastest lap at the 2021 Belgian Grand Prix.
Yeah, so that one will be forever number 1 of the most outrageous scandals in the history of the sport.
It's a real race, but we're not offering a fastest lap. Okay.
Hashtag justice for Mazepin.
Never would say justice for Mazepin, but considering this very quick sidetrack onto modern F1, they're talking about high tech, I think, coming back or in some kind of capacity, and there's potential quote Kazakhstani backers who have links to the Mazepin family. So we may not have seen the last of Nikita Mazepin yet.
We can only hope that justice will be done.
Well, he comes back, gets one fastest lap, and then
just goes away forever.
just rides off into the sunset on his horse.
Oh, that would be something. Anyway,
what a bizarre vision I have in my mind. But
it's a very entertaining vision. I am fully in support of it.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, I guess we don't have to bother with the worst Japanese F1 driver part, because it's Ide. It's just Ide. Anyway, since we partly did that question, do you want to go on with the only one we asked ourselves, which is how we judge Kamui Kobayashi in retrospect, or do you think we addressed that one?
I mean, I guess the reason why, is just for context, that was actually the original question which Lennart and I asked. But I think the reason why I wanted to bring it up with you is because I know on the Discord forum that you have been quite critical when you're using your internet voice, should I say. You're quite critical of maybe not Kobayashi, but generally the fan perception of him as a great driver. So I guess the reason why I wanted to bring up the question was because I'd like to hear your opinion and why you don't think Kobayashi was a great driver, or at least he wasn't worth the hype that was thrown at him when he was racing.
Well, that goes back to a point you made earlier about how Kobayashi would have had a longer career or done, with the implication that he would have done more had he had the money. And while that is true, I don't think it would have amounted to all that much. Again, he was emphatically beaten by Paris. And
True.
while obviously that was pre-top team Sergio Perez, who was the hyped young prospect, the main question is, again, if he had the money, where would he have gone with it? What would he have done with it? Like, I don't see any way he can actually ever be more than a pay driver, so to speak. And even if we ignore that those don't end up at the better teams generally, there's also the thing is, again, there's just, how do I put this? I never got the feeling with Kobayashi, for all the entertaining passes he did, for all the undeniably fun stuff he did, that he ever really had that feeling like if he gets his chance, he will break through. And that is something, obviously, some will argue the same applied for Takuma Sato, so I don't agree with that in the sense that back in 2008, 2009, I'm gonna have to roll back a bit with this one. There were rumors that Takuma Sato was going to get the Toro Rosso drive next to Sebastian Bourdais, because obviously Red Bull, the one market they never have truly cracked is the Japanese energy drink market, because there's a lot of competitors on that market in Japan. And so obviously they were always in a way looking for a potential golden boy from Japan, which is why I imagine they still haven't given up on the Tsunoda experiment yet. But that's another story. And I feel, had he gotten such a chance, had he gotten a way into that Red Bull program, I could hypothetically imagine a world where Sato, in the right circumstances, even progresses to the main team. And I do not see that for Kobayashi. Like Kobayashi, there was nothing there that made me say, yeah, if this guy gets the car, he's going to be a race winner, or heaven forbid, even more. And that I feel is the difference. That, yeah, it's just a question of, is Kobayashi really a guy who was wronged in terms of what he got out of Formula One? I wouldn't say so, and that's why I am overly critical of him when I am in my brain off shit poster mode. Because I just don't think there is more than him than what he has shown us. So that's pretty much the point of it.
Yeah, maybe I'm psychoanalyzing this too much, but like in F1 you have different characters, and you have the world champions, and you have the mainstay drivers like Ricardo, who are usually there or thereabouts because they've proven themselves. But then you also have the kind of journeyman who didn't really ever amount to much. For a long time that was like Kevin Magnussen and Hulkenberg. Funnily enough, both employed by the Haas F1 team these days. But in general, those kind of drivers who were around for many seasons, usually in midfield teams, usually getting the occasional podium. And I feel like people talk about Hulkenberg wasting a seat, for example. He's never got a podium, and he's one driver who most people would say he's never taken the great result. He's usually been there or thereabouts, but he's never taken a great result, and it's so damning for him as a driver overall. I feel like Kamui Kobayashi would have fit into that kind of mold quite well. I reckon he could have had a 5, 6, 7 year career, maybe even like equal to the length of Sato's, for example, whereby he could have got a couple of surprise Perez style podiums in semi-decent machinery for a couple of years, and there is nothing wrong with that. Not every driver has to be a race winner or a mainstay in the ilk of Valtteri Bottas or someone like that. But
that's true.
I think there's room for Kamui Kobayashi's, I would say.
Indeed, especially in a grid that would be larger if we had our way. So
yes, I just had a thought of in my mind. We didn't mention Sakon Yamamoto, the truly the second greatest driver Grand Prix racing ever produced. And it got me thinking of Sakon Yamamoto. There was one race in 2007 where we had 3 Japanese F1 drivers on the grid. It got me thinking about this because Tsunoda was the first driver since Kobayashi who was from Japan to drive in Formula 1. And I just wanted to check, like the 2007 Brazilian Grand Prix, the 3 Japanese drivers on a 22-car grid qualified 18th, 19th, and 22nd. In the race, Sakon Yamamoto crashed into Giancarlo Fisichella, and Takuma Sato finished 2 laps down in 12th in a Super Aguri, and Kazuki Nakajima on his debut finished 1 lap down after screwing up his pit stop and running over one of his mechanics. And that was, as far as I'm aware, the most Japanese drivers except in one race, except for obviously in 76, 77. Truly a glorious nation for Formula 1.
Certainly one with a lot of stories. And with that, we get to the last complex of the Japanese driver questions, which is a very specific one because it is mostly supposed to get me to spout my story about it, which is, let's just say, not part of the orthodoxy, as usual. And that question is, which team was Ukio Katayama supposedly in talks with before he decided to pull out because of his cancer diagnosis?
Well, obviously this is a question for you because this is something which you have done quite a bit of research about. I think you may have even discussed it on a previous podcast, but do tell.
Yeah, first of all, a bit of backstory for those who don't remember the greatest driver Grand Prix racing ever produced.
Shame on you.
Ukio Katayama was a classic pay driver from Japan who, after 2 somewhat anonymous seasons in 1992 and 1993, had a breakout year in 1994 where he managed to pull off some impressive feats in one of the last truly okay-ish turrets, including, as I said, a couple of points finishes. And those points finishes attracted the attention of a top team who, given the state of the driver market in the mid-90s, were desperately looking for a driver to hire. And it is more or less the common belief that, or before we start with that, it should be noted that Katayama did have advanced talks with that team, but according to himself, he pulled out of those talks and rejected the offer because he was diagnosed with cancer and feared that his performance would not be up to what he should be capable of as a driver who has that drive. Of course, it should be noted that the usual asterisks that go with drivers who claim they have contract offers also applies here, but since the story of Ukio Katayama, the top team, is entertaining, we are not going to indulge in that skepticism today. Anyway, the point is, he never said which team he was talking to. And thus, obviously, this mystery is still unresolved. But the common belief is that he was set to sign with Benetton to become the number 2 driver for Michael Schumacher. The obvious reason given for that is that he had financial backing from Japan Tobacco with their Mild 7 brand, which managed to be the sole touch of color on the otherwise very white Tyrrell that year, and managed to add the last beautiful touch on the M197, but that's an opinion for a different day. So, anyway, that's the common belief, but I personally am very convinced that the team he was talking to was McLaren. See, if you remember, McLaren were looking to get back on top after 2 middling years, one of which saw Ayrton Senna leave for Williams. And they eventually ended up settling on Nigel Mansell, the 1992 world champion, who had not many friends in the United States, so to speak, and obviously was looking to come back to Europe after winning the 1994 Australian Grand Prix. And the thing with that story is, though, that both McLaren themselves, in the form of Ron Dennis, and the engine partner, Mercedes-Benz, weren't actually too keen on hiring Mansell. But they didn't want Mansell. Who made them sign Mansell in the end was Marlboro.
I was going to say it was the cigarette company who wanted Mansell because he was the big name.
The ever generous sponsor of all things Formula One. And I personally believe that despite the opposing tobacco sponsorship, they were looking at Katayama simply because it would fit the timeline. You have to remember, Mercedes were in their second year in Formula One at that time, long ago. Very technically third, but we don't count Sauber 1993. So it was very clear, especially with a young Mika Häkkinen, that the McLaren project was not meant to immediately rise to the top. And with that case, a young, exciting pairing of Häkkinen and Katayama makes a lot more sense than, well, Häkkinen and Mansell. How does it? When you think long term. Obviously, Katayama never quite managed to match that 1994 form, but hindsight is 2020.
Yes.
And that is why I feel the common theory of Katayama to Benetton is, while understandable, not actually what I feel is the truth. Because, again, it makes a lot of sense for McLaren to look at this young driver pairing and, well, go with Häkkinen and Katayama. So, yeah, that is my story, and I am sticking to it until someone can find Ukyo Katayama when he's not busy mountaineering or running his own racing team and finally get him to spill the beans.
Yeah, I mean, it's been so many years now that there must be an interview with him probably in Japan, which if you do enough digging and delving, you'll probably find it where he probably has spilled the beans by now. It's been so long that there's no reason why he would need to keep that private, I'm sure.
If only we could speak Japanese.
Yeah, as I'll say, doing the Yuji Ide profile took a long time. I'll say that. If anyone else has infinite amount of time and wants to do some digging and delving into Japanese Formula One interviews with Ukyo Katayama, then I would really appreciate it. We could get an answer to that question.
Good. And since I mentioned Ukyo Katayama was a pay driver, that actually leads to our very next question. Once again from the community, which is, do you attach any meaning to the term pay driver?
Kind of. It's the difference between two drivers who are basically equal worth in terms of behind the seat, in the seat, and in terms of their wallets. It has been throughout F1 history often a deciding factor in keeping teams afloat, even. I was having this conversation. In a way, I was dreading this question, and in a way, looking forward to it, because I was having a conversation with Giri, one of our forum members, when we got lunch yesterday, and we were discussing how it's so rare these days to have a Lance Stroll, Fernando Alonso situation, the way we have right now in 2023, where one driver, it's basically a one driver team where the other driver kind of also turns up and sometimes scores points, whereas the other driver is fighting for the championship.
For a loose definition of fighting for the championship.
You know what I mean. Fernando Alonso is genuinely outperforming Sergio Perez in a Red Bull right now. So for someone to be genuinely challenging for runner-up at the end of 2023 and his teammate to barely be scraping 7th and 8th places, it's so rare these days. But in the old days, it used to be very common. In terms of pay drivers, you would have, especially at Piquet and Senna, something about Brazilian superstars of the 80s almost demanded that they have the world's worst teammates. who would basically, along with the cigarette companies, fund the team to get them good enough cars to be able to win championships with their main driver. You would have scrubs like Johnny Dumfries or
Satoru Nakajima, to go back to the Japanese drivers.
Michael Andretti, people who no one have ever heard of. Nelson Piquet Jr. Too spicy? But yeah, basically drivers who never amounted to anything. No one remembers who they are. And in those days, pay driver meant something. Today, doesn't mean something. Harder to answer. You do get occasionally such as in the early mid 2010s, teams with no money who hire their Gutierrez's over their Kobayashis, for example. Which was obviously the correct decision, because Gutierrez won Reject of the Year twice in our website. So how many did Kobayashi win? He was an award winner, Esteban Gutierrez. But my point is, I don't really know, because it really depends on the financial situation of the teams, and it depends on the financial situation of Formula One itself. Nowadays, Formula One is not in dire straits. Give it 5 years and ask me the question again. And the teams aren't necessarily in a bad state. Like Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hulkenberg have money, but they're not they're not Bruno Senna or Pastor Maldonado kind of level. In terms of bankrolling the team's performances. So it's a tricky question to answer, and therefore I am, after 5 minutes of rambling, I am not going to answer it.
Brilliant. Well, I have a simpler approach to this. To me, a pay driver, or to be more precise to the question, the term pay driver does have a meaning for me. The meaning is that it's a driver that would not have given a specific opportunity if not for the money he brought with him. But one thing, this is something especially with newer fans or younger fans who come in from other sports, for whom the idea that a driver gets a chance because he has the money is something that is just foreign to them, just appalling to them. Like the usual analogy is no soccer player would ever pay for their place on a top team, which technically isn't true, but that's neither here nor there in some cases. But the thing is, that is to me also a very neutral definition, because it is not something that is hard to quantify. Like someone like Fernando Alonso, he came to Ferrari in 2010 with 20 million in the bank. I think it was 20 million from Santander for his ride with Ferrari. But the question is, was he hired by Ferrari just for those $20 million, euros, whatever it was?
Yes.
Obviously. So that's why he is a pay driver. No, joking aside. Obviously he was not. Just to make sure the sarcasm doesn't go unnoticed. Whereas, say, Pastor Maldonado came in 2011, brought in the 40 million from PDVSA to replace Nico Hülkenberg, and would Williams have hired Pastor Maldonado to replace Hülkenberg had he not had the money with him?
Yes.
Obviously. Why would you not hire a GP2 champion? Yes, anyway, again, just to make sure nobody gets lost in the sarcasm, obviously that is also not true.
Stop correcting my sarcasm.
I will in the future, but now
Maldonado
not now.
Maldonado is what you're trying to say is that Maldonado is an equal driver to Fernando Alonso from a very specific lens.
Yes. And you are free to correct my sarcasm now, but if you want to.
Nope.
Excellent. The thing is, that is why I personally don't have much value in terms of the concept of a pay driver, because I didn't pick these examples at random because Maldonado did end up being the last race winner Williams would ever have. And while his career would feather out, it's not like anyone would say, oh, he was always out garbage, he was always a trashy driver in comparison to the classic 90s pay drivers of the John Denny Trust. It is historically known that guys like Michael Schumacher and Niki Lauda, absolute legends of the motorsport world, ended up getting their first Formula One drivers because someone gave the team boss a couple of bags of money in them.
Yeah, that's who I went into the office with a briefcase or two. Yeah.
I actually couldn't remember the word briefcase, as embarrassing as that is.
All right.
Anyway.
And Ayrton Senna as well. Like some people consider all these drivers, like Schumacher, Lauda, and Senna, to be among the greatest drivers of all time, and all of them came in with, as you say, a briefcase of money.
Yeah, that is why, to me, the value pay driver has a meaning, but it's not a slur, so to speak, for sporting drivers. It's just one of the realities of this business, in the past at least, and to a point still today, because let's be honest, Nicolas Latifi wasn't hired for his charming smile, and neither was Nikita Mazepin.
No, Nikita Mazepin was hired to get fastest laps.
Indeed. Hashtag justice for Mazepin. Anyway, that is why I have a meaning for the term pay driver, but it's more an objective quantification than a statement of quality or lack thereof.
Yeah, because pay drivers like rejects, or this always comes back to the original definition, doesn't it? It's like pay drivers aren't a definition of your, they're only a definition of your wallet, not of your quality as a driver.
Good, but since pay driver often tend to draw the ire of the crowd, especially if they are from non-orthodox motorsports nations. No, nobody hated Mazepin just because of Ukraine, trust me. Anyway, that leads to one of the next questions. Drivers who are overhated or underhated?
This is a funny question, because I originally read it as overrated or underrated, and that's such a vague term. But the phrase under or overhated. Do you want to go first for this one? Because I have a couple of ideas in my mind about how these things change over time, but if you have something to begin with, I'll happily bounce off of you.
Yeah, I think one thing with over and under hated is that it obviously says they don't deserve that level of vitriol, or they don't have enough vitriol that they deserve. In that case, I think I am going to go with whomever is the current most dominant driver at the time, because all of them got boos, all of them got jeers from the crowd just for being that damn good. It happened to Vettel, it happened to Hamilton, it happens to Max. And while obviously fans are perfectly entitled to boo and cheer whomever they want because they paid a whole lot of money for these tickets, especially nowadays, it is obviously not the greatest of looks, so to speak, and that is why generally all of them are overhated. All of the really dominant drivers are overhated in a specific way, but someone who I think just generally gets the worst of it is Romain Grosjean. And the thing with Romain Grosjean is that many never let go of the image they built about him in 2012. And in a way it's understandable, first impressions count for a lot, we all know that. And so it's one of those things where a driver just stops doing what he did wrong in the past and gets wiser and gets better with experience, and the first impression still doesn't go away, to a lesser point that also applies to guys like Takuma Sato, who never really fully shook that crash kid image, even though, again, by the Super Guru, yes, he was one of the more reliable drivers on the grid. And so I would say generally speaking, overhated drivers are drivers who are judged for their past when it no longer applies. That is a more general principle than a specific name, because how many Formula 1 drivers are actually hated in that sense? Not many,
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah, like, and Lance Stroll is another example whereby it's like when he came in, he was lambasted as being a rubbish pay driver, which funnily enough drivers like Gutierrez weren't, which I find quite interesting. It very much just depends on the time of day for some people, but
yeah, and I think for many it's also the question of whether someone just outright directly is a walking paycheck, so to speak, or whether they have associations with certain groups or certain nationalities. Like many, I feel, weren't as harsh as Gutierrez as they were in Stroll, simply because Gutierrez was just, oh yeah, he's from Mexico, where also the good Sergio Perez is from, and Mexico should grow as a Formula One nation because it has Formula One tradition. We all remember the great Mexican Grand Prix. Whereas, again, Stroll is Canadian, but Stroll had never had this thing that that he was there as a part of something bigger. He was just, I am the guy with the money, let me drive.
Yeah.
Do you understand what
I understand, yeah, and there's another side of the context, which is also like, who did they replace as well? Because if you have someone who's generally talented being replaced by someone who's just there for their money, like it can roll a few eyebrows, I would say, to people. You have a little bit of a tougher time, how should I say, getting people on your side, and I agree with you about Grosjean, and I think it also somewhat applied to Maldonado as well, who was very crash prone in his first 2 years especially, but he, like Grosjean, mellowed out, and I think you'll probably remember this, Lennart. Our younger viewers probably won't, but in 2014 Romain Grosjean and Pastor Maldonado were announced as teammates at Lotus, and almost the entire F1 circus, F1 rejects included, were laughing their socks off, because they're like, neither of them are going to finish any races. They're going to crash into everyone, and they're going to crash into each other. It's going to be a disaster. I can't think of a single major crash that either driver had during that entire time. They were both very anonymous, which is bad, by the way, just saying that. They were both anonymous. They didn't really do very much of note, aside from a few good results for Grosjean. And
the only crash I remember from them was one where I don't even know whether Maldonado was the victim or the aggressor in that one, where he ended up tangled with Gutierrez at Bahrain, and one of them flipped, literally.
Oh yes, I remember that now. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll take it back somewhat in that sense.
And there was a second one at Austria, but I don't even recall whether it was a crash or whether it was a puncture. But the fact that I don't recall that speaks for itself and actually proves your point. So
you're ruining my point. But
I'm incidentally strengthening it.
In general, Maldonado was hated by the majority of the F1 community. F1 rejects and GP rejects have generally been quite contrarian, in that we often tend to go against the public opinion just often out of principle for any sake. But I would say that Maldonado's reputation as well as a crasher stayed with him until his final days, as did Grosjean's. When they were teammates, they were actually, I'd say, surprisingly calm and average when people were expecting them to crash every race, basically. And it's funny how your reputation is so much different from the actual very dull average reality of what actually happened.
Yeah.
If I could go, one thing that I haven't mentioned, which is sort of obvious, is that like both Lennart and I are speaking from the experience of the F1 but we've watched. Neither of us have made giant bold claims about seasons that are beyond our time, sort of thing. I've watched back to 1990, 1989. But a couple of drivers from the old era, which I would say had bad reputations, who probably didn't deserve them, were one would be Riccardo Patrese, who famously was involved with the crash, which later indirectly led to Ronnie Peterson's death. in 1978, I think it was. And he was basically directly blamed by James Hunt, among other people in the F1 community, for causing the crash and therefore indirectly killing Ronnie Peterson. And it's something where if you watch old F1 broadcasts, especially on the BBC, for example, James Hunt will throw any single piece of criticism at Riccardo Patrese that he can, regardless of the fact that Patrese on pole or won the race or finished on the podium. Patrese was a very competent driver at Williams, 1992's disaster notwithstanding. And when you hear how Patrese is spoken about compared to what you're actually watching, you'll realize that Patrese in his day had a lot of criticism against him. Somewhat conversely, he became the most experienced Formula 1 driver of all time, so obviously not everyone bought into that criticism, but it was a reputation that followed him around till his or at least James Hunt's dying day.
In a variation of that also applies to a less extent to Andrea de Cesaris, who...
That was my next person, yes.
Excellent!
Andrea de Cesaris.
Sorry for taking away your point.
No, please. Andrea de Cesaris is my next one, so please introduce him.
Yeah, well, what needs to be understood about Andrea de Cesaris is that in his early years he was crash-tastic. There's no better word for it.
Crasher is.
Yeah. There was a classic joke that he had the number 8, so his car would look the same whether it was upside down or not, or that he couldn't have the 8 because they wouldn't recognize whether the car was upside up, down. I don't recall the exact joke, but it was something along those lines, which speaks for itself.
Excellent.
And yeah, this is also one driver that sorted himself out, so to speak, that matured as he grew older, as he grew wiser, as he traveled from team to team with his Marlboro sponsorship. From such luminaries as Brabham and McLaren to Real and Tyrrell, at the point where Tyrrell was not a good team anymore. Anyway, the point is he also ended up with over 200 Grand Prix starts, which back in the day meant something. So yeah, it's one of those things which in a way ties into my earlier point that many drivers tend to be judged on the account of what they did in their early years. So
I didn't have any other examples actually beyond those same ones that you brought up and the ones we just mentioned. But I say that's the general idea of someone who's overhated. Underhated, yeah. I don't think I'll answer that. It's so based on opinion. I would say one problem F1 has is because it's run by British media broadcasters. Most British drivers are beloved and adored, and foreign drivers who are not in the Anglosphere have a much bigger challenge, both to get to Formula 1 on their own, but also to impress the media and become popular media personalities. I'll just finish my point. If I had to say anyone who would be underhated by that definition as the opposite of overhated, I would say someone like George Russell, who for someone who's done a lot of crashing in the last year and a half, hasn't really developed a reputation as a crasher, aside from maybe on our Discord community. But please carry on.
Well, I have a very specific type of underhated driver, and that is the driver that glorifies himself at the expense of his team. Now, to understand what I mean, I have to go a bit out there. One of the realities of Formula 1 is, in the end, the car does matter more than the guy who drives it. Like, to take an extreme example, if you have a 1992 Williams driven by, what is a good example, Narain Karthikeyan, and have a 1992 Tyrrell driven by Alan Prost, who would win that race?
Probably Narain Karthikeyan.
Exactly. Barring, of course, any technical issues and crashes. And with that in mind, what I personally detest drivers for, if they glorify themselves by making themselves appear victims of a weak car, of a team that failed them. And there are two prime examples of this. One is the infamous 2012 Ferrari. Because Fernando Alonso has been very willing and very active in embracing the narrative that he managed to take this piece of Italian junk to the top nearly, only to fall victim to the monster Red Bull. And if only he had a team that would have given him such a better car, then he could have done the unthinkable. And that is something I just cannot stand this narrative. I just cannot accept it, because while the Ferrari wasn't as great as, say, the Ferraris of the mid-2000s were, and while it was a very bad car by top team standards at the start of the year, there was not a single point post that first in-season test at, I think it was Mugello, where Ferrari were anything lower than the third best team. And then, as evidenced by the fact that despite Felipe Massa's quite bad 2012, they were only like, I think it was less than 50 points away in the Constructors' Championship. And again, this is a narrative that Alonso has been very willing to milk for himself, just like with the Honda years. And it's just something I cannot stand, and I think we should really be giving him a lot more grief for. And the same also applies to Sir Lewis Hamilton, who over the last 2 seasons has turned it into an art form, has gotten his team to apologize for giving him a bad car when George Russell was nearly hauling it to podiums in the very same race. And it's just, that is just completely appalling. These 2 examples, and I'm sure if we look down the history of Formula 1, there are a lot more, just straight up try to have people believe them that they have no part in the failures. And I cannot stand that. For the life of me, I cannot stand that. Not in F1.
I won't pile on Hamilton here because I could do that all day. But like the
he'll get his when he announces his retirement.
Yeah, like along with his comments at the beginning of the year about how he told his F1 team what was needed to make the car better, which was adding more balance, which he has actually doubled down on recently. I read an interview with him recently where he was talking about how the car needs more balance, which I'm sure is information which will go directly to the engineers.
Yeah, if they are like with that meme with the 2 black guys in front of a computer who are shocked, like, oh my god, why didn't we think of balance?
It's something which I know you haven't been following current F1 too closely, Lennart, but you will be pleased to know that during the Austrian Grand Prix, Hamilton had a bit of a stinker for most of the race and spent the majority of it basically complaining about other drivers cutting the track and complaining that his car wasn't very good, before Toto Wolff came onto the radio and said, if I remember it, quote, "Lewis, we know the car is bad, drive it." which was quite refreshing. It was nice to hear that from a team which is usually apologizing to him. But I would also say, not to antagonize you, I'm not saying this to avoid the Alonso comments. I will get to that in a second. But not to antagonize you, but one thing Hamilton also did was keep his number 44. He's not the only person who's ever done it when in MotoGP, for example, where when they've become world champion, he kept his 44. And in my world of perfect Formula One, the world champion has to pick number 1. Mm-hmm. For me, that's one of the traditions of the sport which has to be kept, not just for tradition's sake, but because it's important.
Yeah, I could rant on about that for a very long time. I just don't want to, because quite frankly it'd probably be boring to listen to. The thing is, I have my own issues with that. Again, we can save that for the eventual Hamilton Reject for a Moment podcast, which we need to think of a good title for, but that's neither here nor there.
We'll have a couple of years, I'm sure. On the Alonso comments, yeah, no, I agree. On that premise, I 100% agree with you that, like, basing yourself against Adrian Newey as he was and an entire Evo team is just not the way to go about it. But I think he got away with it because Ferrari were underdogs to Red Bull, that Red Bull were just a leaner, meaner machine. Proven, I think, in the Asian rounds, especially when they got their act together and Vettel just took 3 or 4 consecutive wins and kind of sealed the deal there and then. But I agree with your points.
Yeah.
One other maybe I'll round out my underhated drivers thing with. You reminded me in your comments about if only I was driving a Red Bull, I would walk the season. If you look it up, there are interviews in 95, 96 with Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger basically saying, screw it, anyone could have won the championship in that Benetton. And before Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger switched to Benetton in Michael Schumacher's place, and we all know how well they did in 96 and 97. There was a fantastic interview I discovered when I was doing the profile for Vincenzo Sospiri, where he had basically been doing his testing in 96 for Benetton, and he got given a bunch of setups, and he got asked to explain what he thought of them, what was good about them, what was bad about them, what could be improved. And he said his favorite one, the best one, and the one that was the fastest one, was the mystery one, because one of them was Alesi's, one of them was Berger's, and one was the mystery one. And they was told afterwards, that was Michael Schumacher's setup. Alesi and Berger don't like it.
Yeah.
It's like, I thought that was really, really wonderful that like they spent all this time complaining about how if only we'd had the machinery to win all these championships in a Benetton, and we saw what happened.
There are 2 things I want to add to that, because it is genuinely very amusing. The thing is, of course, Michael Schumacher was known for having setups other drivers found rather difficult, because he preferred his car with comparatively a lot of oversteer, which surprisingly many top drivers actually do, because they feel it's easier to correct a car that is overreacting than one that is underreacting. And the second part is, I don't have a source for that, so this might not actually have happened. But I do recall very recently reading someone who said that Michael Schumacher apparently said when first testing the Ferrari after having signed for the team, that he was wondering why Ferrari hadn't won a world championship with that car. So
yeah, I've heard this as well. Actually, now you mentioned it. Yeah. Gosh.
So yeah, there are levels to this, which Berger and Alesi have come to learn the hard way. And interestingly, Berger apparently has learned, because especially in a lot of recent interviews, he talked about how he couldn't accept it at the time, but now he admits and accepts that he just wasn't that guy, that he just wasn't that world championship material, so to speak. And yeah, that is a very interesting view, that especially with the earlier points we made about drivers being younger and younger and not having the maturity, is also a very interesting reflection. But
I would say that the most damning thing I remember about Gerhard Berger was when if you ever watched the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix, super famous for the first 10 seconds in which Ayrton Senna rams off Prost and doesn't get disqualified for it. However, most people watch that and then that's all they watch. If you watch the 2 first laps of the race, Gerhard Berger assumes the lead by default and immediately spins on the oil, or whatever it was, left on turn 1, and crashes at the same corner at the beginning of lap 2 that Senna and Prost had crashed at. So, like you were mentioning that Gerhard Berger may not have been it in the World Championship material. Like, he had a free win just awaiting him. All he had to do was keep the car on track, and he managed to the beginning of lap 2. But, sorry, that's a far, far away detour.
Good, but it's actually one we can link to the final question of the day, because, again, the last question of the day is: who is the least deserving modern driver to have been in title contention with 3 or fewer rounds to go?
Yeah, this is a funny one, because we're limited in these answers, because you and I have only watched recent the last 30 years or so. And we are also limited in the fact that not every championship goes down to the wire. In fact, quite the opposite. Many championships really do not go down to the wire. Let's get the easy one out the way and say Eddie Irvine.
Yeah,
Eddie
that's
Irvine
almost
in
a free
1999.
bingo space.
It's such an obvious one. Eddie Irvine he won a race in Australia and developed an early championship haul of points in 1999 for Ferrari. And by his luck, Michael Schumacher, who was just about leading the championship along with Mika Häkkinen, broke his leg at Silverstone, which meant that all the effort was put behind Irvine. However, when it became time for Irvine to actually fight for that championship, he had a lot of propping up behind him. He had famously got allowed to win by Mika Salo in the replacement Ferrari, and then by Schumacher upon Schumacher's return at the Malaysian Grand Prix. He'd just come back with a broken leg and was basically deliberately doing times like 2 or 3 seconds slower than he was able to, just to allow Irvine Pass to win the race. So he was in the right place at the time that he could benefit from a fantastic car which was championship capable, and it got him all the way till the last race of the season. But he was not a championship level driver, but he did okay, I guess. Irvine at least never threw the car away in the way that Häkkinen did that year. I would say that Häkkinen also wasn't exactly the best championship contender that year. Most people would say that Heinz-Harald Frentzen was, but yeah, Irvine is the easy one.
So Frentzen is actually the next one to go if we want to talk about just their overall level as a driver, because you have to remember Heinz-Harald Frenzen's title challenge, for all it lasted, was just coming 2 years after being given one of the powerful new Williams and doing a grand total of nothing with it. So yeah, that is a problem. We're talking about very high driver standards here. And when you look at these high standards and see Frentzen, what he did at Williams, and then realize that while he was in the championship contention, again, it was only 2 years after his total failure at an actual top team. Yeah, I think he also is so controversial, but in my case, in my opinion, legitimate pick.
Yeah, it's that it really raises a lot of questions, as these things always do, because of Formula One is complicated. It's like, was he bad at Williams because of the environment that he was in? Most people would say yes. As far as I understand, that he really didn't get on with Patrick Head, especially. Was he just better? Was he a Fisichella? Was he a Perez, where he just seems to thrive really well in midfield teams and not in major teams? It's a hard question to answer. I don't know. Frentzen was very good in 99, but most of his rest of his career, outside of Jordan especially, he struggled. It was a good decision to hire him for 97, but he threw it away basically outside of Imola. It's a tough one, but I know I think many people will probably be annoyed at you for mentioning Frentzen in this conversation, but it's valid. Like, in terms of, if you're judging by him by his entire career, then yes.
Yeah, I think those are really the two big names. So, of course, since the question is very specific in mathematically speaking, three races
with 3
of
rounds
you.
remaining. 3 rounds remaining. A driver who is still within championship contention, the least deserving. My next answer would be Damon Hill in 1993.
Yeah.
Whose existence in the championship run was entirely due to Alain Prost's incompetence. I don't know what was going on with Alain Prost. I think he retired at the right time, because in 1993 he let a lot of wins go. He was probably in the same level of car that Nigel Mansell was in the year before.
The thing is,
okay.
The thing is,
Right.
no, I don't generally disagree in terms of relative dominance, but according to sources from the times, in 1993 Williams was a lot more difficult to drive compared to the 1992 version, because certain rule changes have meant that certain things when technological gadgets weren't quite working as orderly as they would have. So it's not a one-to-one comparison. That's all I'm trying to say here. So not really disagreeing with your point, just specifying it to avoid inaccuracies.
Damon Hill won a championship in '96 when he had a rookie teammate and he barely won it. There was one team fighting for the championship in '96 and Hill barely won the fight of two people. In his debut season, Hill was challenging for wins. He got 3 wins in a row, actually, in '93, where his soon-to-be 4-time world champion teammate Alain Prost sort of wandered to the title in a way that you would have expected him to do far better with. So I would say Hill didn't deserve to be in contention for that title, not because of his own skill, but because of the circumstances of Alain Prost not being good enough, basically, to sew up the title sooner.
Yeah, but on the topic of mathematical opportunities, we have to talk about the one, the only Nick Heidfeld.
Excellent answer.
Because in 2008 he was very much a championship contender after the fourth to last race, the Singapore Grand Prix of known infamy. So, yeah, I mean, the prime question is now Heidfeld or Irvine?
Why is Heidfeld not deserving to have been in title contention? Heidfeld was a great driver, and he never had a championship-capable car.
But a driver who has literally never won a race being in title contention?
I don't understand. I take personal offense to this mention of Nick Heidfeld in this conversation.
Well, it's just odd, to say the very least.
The greatest German F1 driver of 2007, no less.
Undeniably so.
I get what you mean. The other obvious one is Jenson Button in 2010, who was, again, kind of there by convenience rather than by his actual own ability. He had a great beginning to the season because he won 2 races which were in very changeable conditions, which Button absolutely starred in. But outside of those 2 opening races, he never won any more races for the rest of the season. Lewis Hamilton was easily the dominant driver in McLaren that year, and more just due to Sebastian Vettel's constant blow-ups and then him crashing into his teammate tended to artificially tighten the championship in Alonso and McLaren's favour. And the fact that Jenson Button was actually in championship contention with 2 rounds remaining, I think is pretty telling of just how unreliable Vettel, Webber and Red Bull were in 2010.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, if we talk about Red Bull not getting the job done or not putting the foot down, obviously we can't mention 2012 either. We mostly did, so I don't think we actually talked about that, the mathematical contenders late in the season, because both Hamilton and Webber, who in the first case had a very on-off performance, so to speak, and who in the other case was, well, late stage Mark Webber.
Yeah. So, Webber post 2010 is a sad Webber.
Yeah, those are also obvious names, but obviously the king shit of all anti-surfing Formula 1 title contenders is Eddie Irvine, and after that you pretty much, in a way it's all conversation stopped. Like, we kind of, if we're being honest, we're just kind of padding, aren't we?
Did you know, Lennart, in the research for this, I discovered this. In 2003, which was one of our most recent podcasts, in 2003, with 3 rounds to go, there were 7 drivers still in contention.
I knew that it was a lot, but I didn't have the exact number on me.
So, in 2003, after the Hungarian Grand Prix, Michael Schumacher, Kimi Räikkönen, Juan Pablo Montoya, Rubens Barrichello, Ralf Schumacher, Fernando Alonso, and David Coulthard were all still technically in championship contention. I think, maybe, is 2003 David Coulthard on the list? Should he be on the list?
Yeah, he should be on the list. Like, I defended him, but the reality is,
he probably shouldn't have been in championship contention.
Yeah.
In 2003.
Exactly. So imagine a world where he actually pulled it off, where everything went so right that after the drizzling shit of a year he had, just everything's come together. He rattles off 3 wins in a row and takes the fucking title. I swear, that would be a story for the ages.
I'd never hear the end of it. I can't imagine him doing the BBC commentary with that. That is his reputation behind him.
Yeah, I cannot imagine it either, but it would be a story for the ages, one way or another.
Okay.
Funny fantasies. Yeah. Well, those were... Actually, there's one question left, but we are kind of running along, and I don't think it's a particularly interesting one. The question is, wasted drive in competent cars, worst years for competent drivers? Or do we want to make that a separate one?
Nah, we've already answered that in previous podcasts.
Yeah,
Williams 2012.
Then
it's an RD99.
Yeah, then we'll cut that out, and especially since you didn't even attribute it outside of community, which is not very specific. Okay, then I will wrap up with the attributions and...
Yeah, so give the shout outs as well before we end.
Alright, then 3, 2, 1, recording again. Well, that was the last question we had on the list, and we want to thank everyone who took the time to think of questions, in particular one of our own authors, the great Martin Jones, who provided the super majority of the questions we answered today. We also want to shout out Anna and Falcon, who both contributed questions of their own, and in a way ourselves for what the Kamui Kobayashi question.
Thanks, us.
Thanks. Yes, but anyway, thank you very much for your interest in the Teammate Collision in this Q&A podcast, for providing us questions. And of course, thank you to everyone listening to us right now. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your interest in our opinions, and we sure hope you will have enjoyed this episode and are looking forward to the next one.
Next thing to do is to get a AI art of Nikita Mazepin riding on a horse into the sunset for the cover of this podcast.
That is a very good idea. You should get on it. Anyway, thank you everyone, and we hope to have you with us next time as well. But we have to leave you with one important lesson. Where teammates are close, teammates collide.